Hi everybody, my name is Elizabeth and I'm a librarian here at the LSC Tomball Community Library. Welcome back to Baking is Baking, the series where we're not always baking anything, but where we are always talking about food. To kick things off today, I want to start with a little bit of an anecdote. I've been a vegetarian of some form or fashion off and on since I was about 12 years old. And growing up in suburban Kentucky, that means that I have fielded all kinds of comments from friends, family, and perfect strangers alike who had something to say about my dietary restrictions. I've also come into contact with all kinds of stereotypes from people about what my eating habits must mean about me as a person. And one that I've run into over and over the years is that the fact that I don't eat meat must mean that I am some sort of hippie. Doing these videos, though, I've done a fair amount of research into the history of vegetarianism, and that research has showed me that the modern vegetarian movement in the United States didn't really kick off until around the 1970s, which is well after the hippie era was over. So were hippies vegetarians? And if they weren't, where did this stereotype come from? Today, we are going to get to the bottom of this historical food mystery and make a vintage vegetarian recipe in the process. To talk about what the hippies were eating, we actually need to start by talking about what people in the 1950s were eating. Following the end of World War II, the US economy was flush with cash in addition to unprecedented food choices, as the food rationing of the Second World War was coming to a close. Additionally, the television was becoming more accessible and more common in American homes, which was having an impact on what people were eating. Because of this new technology, the US government decided to use it to promote a healthy diet in American citizens. They did this by airing public service announcements and educational films about nutrition, which promoted a well-rounded, balanced diet that included meat in addition to vegetables, carbs, and fats. The best example of this would have to be the TV dinner, which is the precursor to a lot of the frozen meals that we eat today. Swanson, the company who created the very first TV dinners, actually made them by accident. Following the Thanksgiving season of 1953, Swanson found themselves in possession of a surplus of frozen turkey. Trying to make the best of this situation, they decided to repackage it with other holiday sides like stuffing and sweet potatoes to be kind of a ready-made frozen holiday meal. But unbeknownst to them, this was actually a perfect reflection of what people were eating in the 1950s. And the perfectly portioned and neatly divided food groups of the TV dinner will be emblematic of the kinds of things that people were eating in the 1950s. So what does any of this have to do with hippies? Well, you might be surprised. Firstly, we need to define what we're talking about when we talk about hippies. The term hippies was initially only used to describe the quote-unquote flower children who were flocking to San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district in the 1960s, but has since been expanded to refer to people in several similar communities around the same time. These groups have since been referred to under the umbrella term of the counterculture. The counterculture was a loosely defined social, cultural, and political movement that many scholars think of as beginning sometime after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963 and before the Manson family murders in 1969. In the 6 years in between, the popular and youth cultures of the time were dominated by a strong anti-authority and anti-establishment sentiment. This combined with a dissatisfaction with the handling of the Vietnam War, the widespread use of psychedelic drugs, the proliferation of rock music, and the momentum being gained by both the civil rights movement and the second wave of American feminism, culminated in what we now think of as being the counterculture. As the name suggests, the counterculture attempted to position itself as being counter to all of the values and institutions of America in the 1950s and 1960s. This resulted in hippies living communally in communes, refusing to take up professional jobs, practicing free love, and evading the draft for the Vietnam War. Counterculture set out to be as comprehensive as possible in its disavowal of the values of contemporary American society at the time. And although this didn't always work out quite as they planned, this did extend to the food they were eating. As Sandra Johnson claims in her paper Edible Activism, Food and the Counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s, the hippies did consider food to be one of the things about American culture that needed to be revolutionized. In particular, they wanted to disavow the foods that they had grown up eating, namely processed or factory-produced foods. They did this in a few ways, largely by turning away from shopping at major grocery stores and instead choosing to source their food from the relatively new phenomenon of health food stores, natural food cooperatives, or by growing it themselves on agricultural communes. Hippies considered the food that Americans were eating at the time to be both unhealthy and unethical, and attempted to position their dietary habits as being both natural and common sense. But were they vegetarian? You might be surprised to find out that, generally speaking, they weren't. For most hippies at the time, the nutritional value and natural source of foods was considered to be more important than whether or not it contained animal products. Of the hippies that were vegetarians, most of them were converts to Asian religious traditions that advocated vegetarianism in some way, like certain aspects of Hinduism or Buddhism. These traditions were wildly popular in countercultural circles at the time, but still, generally speaking, most hippies were not vegetarians. If the hippies weren't vegetarians, where did this idea come from? Well, probably from a couple of places. While vegetarianism was not widespread among any group in the United States in the 1960s, it was probably more common among hippies than it was among the general population at the time, so that could have seemed noteworthy to people who were seeing these events as they happened. The other possible answer is a little bit of historical conflation. Scholars generally agree that the beginning of the American vegetarian movement was in 1971 with the publication of Diet for a Small Planet by Frances Moore Lappé. Lappé argues in this book that the source of global hunger as an issue was in ineffective food policy, particularly in our over-reliance on meat as a part of our diet. She advocates a vegetarian diet, which she claims will solve global hunger, keep the environment from collapsing, and provide the same nutritional benefits as a traditional Western diet would. Diet for a Small Planet was a runaway success, selling over 3 million copies and essentially jump-starting the American vegetarian movement entirely on its own. And although it came out in 1971, it seems in many ways to be the inheritor of the hippie philosophy, advocating for a vegetarian diet not necessarily because it was good for you, but because it was good for the planet and it was good for society. Vegetarian food has changed a lot in the last 50 years, so I thought that it would be fun to make a recipe from Diet for a Small Planet here today. Just for full transparency, the recipe I'm going to be making is actually from the revised and updated edition of Diet for a Small Planet, which was published in 1982, but it still sounds totally delicious, so we are going to make it here today. So stay tuned to learn how you can make vegetarian Middle Eastern tacos from Diet for a Small Planet. To make Frances Moore Lappé's Middle Eastern tacos, you will need 3 cups of cooked garbanzo beans, half a cup of toasted sesame seeds, 2 cloves of garlic, 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, 3/4 of a teaspoon of ground coriander, salt to taste, half a teaspoon of ground cumin, half a teaspoon of cayenne pepper, wheat tortillas, and yogurt, lettuce, tomatoes, or onions to garnish. Assembling the tacos is nice and simple. To start, take your garbanzo beans, sesame seeds, garlic, lemon juice, coriander, salt, cumin, and cayenne pepper, and add them all to a blender. Blend into a paste, adding water or liquid from the garbanzo bean can to smooth the paste if necessary. Next, take your tortillas and fill them with your bean mixture. The recipe says that you can either serve the tacos cold or warm, so I'm going to line them up on a baking sheet and place them in the oven at 350 for a few minutes to warm them up. Remove your warm tacos from the oven, add your garnishes, serve, and enjoy. Now that you've got your finished vintage vegetarian tacos, I would recommend checking out Diet for a Small Planet, which you can check out from the Harris County Public Library. In addition to a whole bunch of vegetarian recipes, it's also a fascinating artifact of what vegetarian eating looked like nearly half a century ago. Thank you for watching this episode of Baking is Making. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter so that you never miss a future episode of Baking is Making or any of our other great online programs. And if you yourself are a vegetarian or a vegan, I would love to hear what wacky assumptions people have made about you because of that. I know these are always really funny, but it is interesting to kind of trace the evolution of these stereotypes. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!